Right now, if you had to describe to someone what dyslexia is from what we've covered so far, I want you to turn to your neighbor and tell each other what dyslexia is. You were talking quite a while to each other. By the end of this workshop, I want you to be able to give the elevator definition. Like if you're between the 10th and the 5th floor and somebody asks you what is dyslexia, I want us to be able to give them a reasonable idea, okay? Right now we're going to look, I hope, at a video of students talking about what life was like for them in school before they came to have help at Shelton and what it's like since then. And it sounds like a commercial for Shelton. We didn't mean it to be this way, but we just didn't rehearse them and didn't give them the questions ahead of time. Just the videographer and staff member said, "Tell me about this." And so they say it better than thousands of words. Okay.
When I was at my other school, I felt out of place. I felt upset.
Oh, you're dyslexic? Oh, what's that? Or like, I've heard of it. And they don't know what to do about it.
It was hard to even get a teacher to know your name.
And it made me feel terrible. And I just didn't know what to do.
I'd have trouble learning one step, and that step was too hard. Like, it wasn't too hard for me. I just learned it differently.
I just started struggling and stuff, and I felt like I was going to fall behind, and I thought I was going to get held back.
I've talked to kids and my friends who go to different schools and kids who go here went to school with them. They were so unhappy, so mean to people, and they come to Shelton and they love it because they know that they're here for a reason. Everybody else is here for a reason, and it just makes them happy and it makes them feel in place.
And then you want to do better and prove to yourself, prove to your parents, prove to all the people back at your other school, even though they don't know it. You just want to prove to them, I can do better than what I was before, and I'm going to show it to you through my grades.
There are kids that come to us kind of late in the game with a late diagnosis, and confidence is really shaken.
The big part about school is learning and actually not feeling left out of things, and not feeling bad about things.
We do everything that we can as teachers to build them up and to make them feel successful.
You feel in place. Nobody's going to make fun of you.
The most important thing that we can do for the kids is to foster that self-concept and that self-worth.
I knew I was smart. I just didn't think I was as smart as I was.
I know that if I went into a job interview and I didn't know my strengths, like if I was at my old school and I didn't really know myself and I was still kind of feeling shunned out, I wouldn't know that I could talk as well as I do or as good people skills as I know that I do.
I want to go to college. I want to get a good job. I want to have a family. And if nobody teaches me that way, then I can't do it. It's either, do or don't, and I'm going with do.
Well, all the kids here, since we all have like the same problems, we're all understanding. And so even if somebody kind of like makes fun of you, they're like, oh, you read slow. We're like, hey, you do too. Like we all do. And so it doesn't hurt really.
I feel a lot better about myself.
To watch them blossom, to watch them come into their own is really one of the greatest rewards of this job.
If you don't feel good about yourself at your school now, trust me, you will feel really good about yourself once you go to Shelton for a few years.
They can explain something to you, and if you don't get it, they have like 5-6 other ways like that they can tell it so that you understand it.
It's awesome what they do, and they care about you. If you have questions, they'll come and answer it.
When you know that you're getting that attention and that you're making progress, it feels so good. And that just makes you want to work harder. It's really comforting to know that like you're good at something, and it's not that you were dumb somewhere else or that they're easy on us here. It's just that they teach us differently so that it makes sense to us.
When you come to Shelton, it simplifies everything. All you have to do is just pay attention and work and relax.
I don't know, it's mainly the teachers because they're the ones who really do all the magic, I guess. I don't know.
Since I've been at Shelton, I feel so much better and I have more confidence in myself. And I don't really want to leave until after 12th grade. It just gives me a good feeling inside. I love it. How I feel. I can't really explain it. I just can't explain it in words. It's too hard. It just gives you a good feeling.
Yeah, they're quite verbal and able to express their opinions. Do they seem intelligent to you? And yet, some kids just like this, one boy in particular that came here, and I didn't know this when he came here, but he came in the 6th grade. And when he was a senior, he was the valedictorian, and he gave a talk at our Grandparents' Day. And he told a story that I had never heard, that in the school that he went to before, he didn't do well at all. And he had a couple of friends who weren't doing very well either. And a teacher saw them in the hall and touched each one on the head and said, "Idiot, idiot, idiot." And he went on to say, "Now, I'm the valedictorian of my class. I have become an Eagle Scout. I'm an athlete, and I'm going to college." And if he hadn't had some intervention, these things wouldn't have happened for him. So many times as I talk to foundations and individuals about donations to Shelton for scholarships, which we never have enough of, they'll say, "Oh, there's so many causes." And I said, "I know, there really are." And some of those causes in their mind are life-threatening, which they are, like cancer. But what they don't realize is that having a learning difference that's untreated can be life-threatening also. I've known a lot of kids through the years who, through hard work and not much remediation, made it through school and made it into all kinds of professions, all kinds. But there are some that don't have as many ways to compensate for the learning differences, and they didn't make it. And so they go to school and they drop out, and they go to a junior college and they drop out. And they go back and try again because they really wanted an education, and they would drop out. And they got jobs, and they didn't always have the skills for the jobs, and so they'd lose jobs. And they were moving from one job to another, and often one marriage to another. When you have a learning difference, and a lot of those kids spend their life hiding it from everybody because they're embarrassed about it, it's hard to have a really close relationship with somebody if you won't let them know who you really are. I've known students that committed suicide or tried to kill themselves with drugs and alcohol. And so, for me, learning differences is not just a little reading problem. It's a life problem, which help can be more life-changing than almost any kind of handicap. Because there is so much that can be done to bring these students to typical performance, like most students have, where with children with much more severe difficulties, their remediation can improve, but not bring them to always a totally functional level. So this is a group of people who society really ought to invest in. because of the value and creativity that they have. So I think seeing those students maybe brought a picture to your mind that you could tie to some of those experiences that you had before lunch. Because that's the kind of thing that they were dealing with in school. So now we're going to just list the types of perceptual errors that you'll see in the academic work of students with learning differences. Visual discrimination, visual memory, visual motor, auditory discrimination, auditory memory. When we talk about types of perceptual errors, visual discrimination errors would be things like perceiving the D for the B as you're reading or trying to write, perceiving the P for the Q, the M for the W, this is a vertical reversal, and the N for the U. So sometimes as the student is reading, he's perceiving it accurately and other times inaccurately. Visual memory. If I put 5 sentences in front of you in English and ask you to copy them, what would be your first step? What would be the first thing you'd do? Right, you'd read sentence number 1. And then you would probably look down, and if it wasn't too long a sentence, you'd just write it down because you could hold it in your visual memory long enough to put it on paper. And then you'd go to sentence 2 and going all the way through. What if I put 5 sentences in Greek on the board in front of you? What's your first step? Look at the first letter and try to copy it down. Whether your visual memory could hold on to just one unfamiliar symbol or maybe more than one, but think about the task of copying 5 sentences in a language that has symbols that you don't know how to use. And so you can't hold a string of unrelated symbols in mind well enough to do this rapidly. So you have to do it almost letter by letter. And since you're sitting at a desk and it's up here on the board, you can't put your finger under it and keep your place, so you might do what? Leave out some letters, even leave out some words, even drop from one line to the other and not realize that you've done that. Well, for dyslexic individuals, reading English is like reading Greek to them. Any language with symbols is a challenge for them. So it's going to take them much longer to copy from the board than it does other children, even to copy from a book right next to them. Visual motor. Examples would be dictation. So if I were dictating sentences to you or dictating spelling words, you have to receive the auditory message. You have to hold it in your auditory memory while you think of the visual symbols that make those sounds, the letters, and then your motor system has to work to put them down on your paper. So I don't think most teachers dictating a little first grade spelling list realize what kind of processing that takes, from auditory to visual motor. Another example would be written expression. If I have to write a paragraph or a creative story, I still have to get my ideas and hold them in mind while I think of the symbols and then put the symbols down. And sometimes when I think of those symbols, I may get the right symbol, sometimes I get the wrong symbol. Auditory discrimination, telling one sound from another or one word from another. So I was teaching a 6th grade class of boys, and I said, knowing they have auditory problems, I never turn my back on them when I'm giving any kind of direction, and I speak more slowly as I'm doing in this lecture, because one of the biggest favors you can give people doing auditory processing is slow your rate of speech down, and secondly, articulate the final sounds in words. Most of us don't. When we're in conversation, we're just sort of running it together and not putting like the final T sounds on our words. But it's important when we're talking or dictating to overemphasize those final sounds. Now, you don't have to sound like a robot, but you do have to put the ending sounds on your words instead of dropping them or swallowing them. So when we say W-E-N-T, we say went, not went, moving it on into the next word. We had a high school girl here, some of you may have heard this example. She was in our drama class and she was learning to build sets. They design and build their own sets, and we have a shop. And so they have to go through OSHA training and know the rules of working in the shop. And the teacher was going through them, and the girl raised her hand and said, "I don't get it, Mr. S." And he said, "What don't you get?" And she said, "I don't understand why we can't wear cologne." What he had said was, "Do not work alone." She perceived it as, "Do not wear cologne." So this happens constantly in working with the students that have these auditory processing problems. And so we all, smile, sometimes even laugh about the misperception, but it's really not so funny when you think all day long people are saying things to this person that they're not perceiving accurately, and sometimes very confused about. So many of these kids with these real auditory processing difficulties I've heard described by teachers as airheads, because it looks like you're not smart when half the time you don't understand what somebody's saying to you. I often see the same look of strain on those students' face that I see on children with hearing impairments that I work with. But they can hear it, they just can't discriminate it. There's a difference. So have you ever been in a room and people were a room away and they were having a conversation and you could hear their voices, but you couldn't make out the words? So that's like having this auditory discrimination problem. I'm not perceiving the sounds precisely and accurately. Auditory memory would be following directions. So in a classroom where the teacher might say, "Get out your math book, we're having math on page 45, do the first 5 problems at the top of the page." And somebody with auditory memory difficulties will say, what subject are we having? What page are we on? How many problems did you say to do? Well, I just told you that. Well, told them much too fast, without very good articulation. The way we would give directions is, listen, these are the directions. Eyes on me. In your math book, turn to page 45. 4, 5. Then I turn around and write 45 on the board. Then I walk up and down the rows to see if they're on 45 or 54, or lost somewhere in the front of the book, not knowing that 45 is a little bit further back in the book. Good. We're on page 45. Put your finger on problem number 1. Let's move across the line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do those 5 problems. Raise your hand if you have any problems or questions. I'll come to you. What page did I say we were on? 45. Let's everybody say that. 45. 45. Good. How many problems are we doing? 5. Excellent. Begin. Now, it doesn't take me very long to do that. And some children don't need it that explicit, but for those who do, they won't be left out of the directions. And then we walk up and down the rows to see if they're really where we hoped they would be, and if they were able to hold on to those directions and get their work started. For many of these kids, getting started is the hardest step. And for many of them, they're so used to getting the directions wrong that before you get the directions out of your mouth, they're up at your desk saying, I don't understand. Okay, tell me what you think you're supposed to do. They tell me, I said, that's it. But they just wanted to be double sure. Because many experiences were, I thought I knew, I did it, and it was wrong. I'm not having that happen again. So the only way you can really know what a person heard that you said is to ask them to repeat it back to you. So in our preschool classes and kindergarten and the first, second grade classes, even throughout the school, when we give directions, we ask them to repeat them to us. That tells us how much of that did they hear. Did they hear the first part of a 3-part direction and that's all? Did they hear the last part of the direction and that's all? Did they get the first and third part? What are they perceiving auditorily? As they get older in note-taking, they have a real struggle because they're trying to take down every word that somebody says. Most people that are good at note-taking start using some abbreviations and symbols and getting the main words that are being said, but not literally every word out of the person's mouth that's giving a lecture. And so we have to show them how to take notes. And we do this with a program called Cornell Notes. Just like we have to show them how to get the main idea out of what they're reading. Because for many of these students, particularly the ADHD students who have trouble with priority setting, everything seems equally important to them. So if you just hand them a highlighter and say, highlight what's important in this chapter, what do you see? Everything's highlighted. So what's the main idea of this story? And there's some little part that they found interesting, and they tell you that little part, that isn't the main idea. It captured their attention, but getting the big picture is a real struggle for some students, and it's a comprehension skill that has to be taught. Now, with younger children, we have this quote from Sylvia Richardson. If you would identify children who are high risk for academic learning tasks with the goal of providing early intervention, evaluate coordination, language, attention, and perception. So if you remember CLAP, coordination, language, attention, and perception. So from the time a baby's born, when they go to the doctor, the pediatrician, what are they checking the normal well baby visit? What are they checking on? They're checking on their motor skills. Does this baby lift up his head? Some babies can do that right after they're born. Other babies, it's several weeks later before they're really able to hold their head up for any amount of time. And so the very first thing that develops is being able to lift up the head. Human beings develop from cephalocaudal, that means head to the tail, proximo, midline of the body, distal. So I can raise my head, and then I'm going to, next big motor step is I'm going to be able to turn over, and then I'm going to be able to sit up, and then crawl, and then pull up and cruise around holding on to furniture, and then somewhere around a year take my first step is typical development. For some they walk earlier, for some they walk a little later, but generally the doctor is seeing, is that motor development going along? And generally the parents are noting it too, because other friends have a child who is now crawling or standing up, and so they're saying, well, okay, isn't it time for this to happen? Or they're reading baby books, or they're comparing the younger child to what the older children did. Language. The development of receptive language. Is this baby starting to understand what we're saying to them? And then the development of expressive language. Is the baby starting to say words or even attempt to say words at about a year of age? My oldest son's first word was cup. And I knew it was a word because he said it every time he saw that object or when he wanted something to drink. But it wasn't perfectly articulated, it was more like cup. But when a child has associated meaning with an object or a person, like mama, and they're only using it in connection with that person or object, then you know it's a word. If when they're younger, they're babbling, ba, 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 da, 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 that's not talking. Sometimes I'll have a daddy tell me, oh yes, he was talking when he was 6 months old. They don't do that. They go through stages of learning to talk. Language development is the most definitive red flag that would be waving at you that the child's development is not proceeding typically, and there might be some learning challenges. The first federal grant that I ran, I was working with dyslexia and reading disorders, and guess who was referred for testing? Almost without fail, the children I had been working with as a speech pathologist who had articulation difficulties. They weren't perceiving the sounds accurately, and they weren't able to produce them accurately. So here was an at-risk symptom for auditory processing difficulties. He's showing us he has auditory processing difficulties. There was nothing wrong with his teeth, his tongue, or his lips. He wasn't imitating the sound because he wasn't perceiving it correctly. Now, a lot of children say incorrect sounds when they're learning to talk. So wed for red is pretty common, the W for the R. Whittle for little, the W for the L. Fun for sun, the TH for the S. very common. But as the child is exposed to more and more language, even without any direct intervention, they have an auditory system that is maturing and becoming more precise, and they self-correct those errors somewhere around 3, 4, 5 years of age. If they're persisting on into 6, 7, 8, then they're not going away by themselves. They're going to have intervention with a speech pathologist to get the child to have the ear training, auditory training that they need to perceive the differences in sound. Because for them, the oo and the are the same thing. So I'll see parents saying, no, don't say wed, say red, red. And the child will say, wed. Because I don't hear any difference in those two. That discrimination isn't there yet. The children that had language problems, who were referred to me as a speech pathologist for slow development of vocabulary and language, later were referred for reading problems that were related to comprehension. So they weren't getting word meanings when they were younger. So language and speech, to me, are something that you don't delay working on. And you don't delay having them in an early intervention preschool so that we can do as much work on that as possible before they get to reading. So in modern days, a lot of speech language pathologists are being taught, wait till they're older before you start working on these sounds. But I, as an old-fashioned speech pathologist, would never do that, because I want them to be perceiving the sounds correctly so that they will perceive them correctly, enhancing their ability to learn to read. How am I going to read these words if I don't perceive what the sounds are in them? Attention. There is a within normal limits of attention for a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old. It's not the same as an 8 or a 10 or a 12-year-old, typical developing child. But a child with ADHD at 3 is quite different than a typical child in their ability to focus and sustain attention. There's almost like they are motor driven, and it's not something that they know how to control. Perception. Parents don't have many ways to know whether perception is developing typically, and most teachers don't either. Montessori teachers do. The sensorial curriculum. The sensorial curriculum is diagnostic of perception and perception difficulties, and it is also remedial. So as we present to a child the Pink Tower, and we are offering them the opportunity to perceive the difference in size from a large pink cube to the very smallest pink cube. And each one of those cubes varies by 1 centimeter. So the largest is 10 times larger than the smallest. There's great contrast there. So when we build the Pink Tower for children, and then we take it down and say, your turn, as we watch, we are seeing what their perception is of size discrimination. Now, when you're using all 10 cubes, the size discrimination is at the just noticeable difference level. So in psychological research, the just noticeable difference, and another example would be, if the lights in this room started to dim, there would be a place that they get where somebody would notice something's going on with these lights. And then if they continued to go down, all of us would realize it's getting darker in here. That just noticeable difference place in our perception is where Montessori put the discrimination of all the sensorial materials. So as this child is building this pink tower, they're just not building a cutesy little tower. The concept that they're getting is greater than and less than. If they can't build that tower, they would have no way of working in math with greater than and less than, which is totally abstract. How can you understand that 3 is greater than 2 if you don't even see the difference, perceive the difference between a larger and a smaller cube? So for me, the foundation of math is in that sensorial curriculum. And certainly it's in the pink tower and in all of the counting that we do. That's all the foundation for math. So discriminating between those cubes, well, every child that we present to doesn't imitate it perfectly the first time, do they? So in a Montessori classroom, what we do is present it and then watch as we observe and see, does the child choose it again? Does he work with it? Is he doing any self-discovery? Is he finding out more and more how to build it in gradation? A lot of times they start it in gradation, lose the gradation in the middle, and are back to the gradation at the end, which is typical in perception for any of us. If we misperceive things, it's usually in the middle of a series. If you misperceive a telephone number, it's usually going to be those middle numbers. So as we watch this child and they choose it any number of times, and especially here where we know we're working with at-risk children, we will move in and start doing some more direct instruction to show them what we're trying to do when we build that pink tower. For example, what's one thing we could do if the child just isn't getting it with all 10? Reduce the number to 5. You could even reduce the number to 3, the largest, the smallest, and a middle-sized one. So you increase the difference in perception of the gradation, don't you? Making it a simpler task. And then you try to build it back up. I had a child who, with all the kind of reduction of difficulty, was still very confused. And so I did something that is backwards to the way we usually do it. I used language to help his perception. So we had the pink cubes on the rug in random order. And I said, John, find the big one. Found the largest cube, put it in the middle of the rug. Find the big one. He found the next one and put it in the middle of the rug. Find the big one. I didn't have to say anything after that. He couldn't figure out how we were making that choice. What should he look at when he looks at all of those spread out? So here was another way in to try to give him an assist. That isn't the usual way we do it. That's a therapeutic strategy to help a child that's not getting it after an inordinate amount of time. And I can't tell you what day you say, I need to move in. This is something that comes with experience and the feel that a child is confused and needs additional strategies to be able to do something. So here in this remarkable sensorial curriculum, we can see the visual activities for perception. And so what are those? What are some of the visual activities?
Color tablets.
Okay. Color tablets,
Broad stairs.
broad stairs, and all the things we're naming now are visual, aren't they? So it's size and shape and color. And so then what do we have in auditory perception? Sound cylinders, loud and soft, and the bells matching one tone to another. A really interesting thing to me is that when I first went to Brazil, we didn't have the bells, but after I finally was able to get some ordered, the music teacher said to me, I don't know what's different this year, but these children are being able to match tones better and sing their little songs on key better. And I said, I don't know what's different either, except the bells. And so this is ear training of gross sounds, these pure tones, matching one to another. So what we're working on is the underpinnings of reading, writing, spelling, mathematics. We're working on the perceptual foundation, and yet sometimes parents will come in, and especially dads will say to me, I don't want my kid cutting carrots, I want him doing math. Or what is he doing building these pink towers? And so we have to explain cutting the carrots is not just learning to cut carrots. It's eye-hand coordination. It's fine motor skill development. It's going about a learning task in a sequence. It's so many things about focusing and attention. The sensorial materials are not just what they look like. They're also helping with eye-hand coordination, fine motor skill development, the preparation of the hand for writing, learning to do things in a sequence and in an organization that you need for learning. So we can't be in a hurry. I was in a school where one teacher wanted to jump real fast and push in reading and writing to make parents happy. And another teacher spent most of the first semester with her young class, a lot of work on practical life and sensorial, beginning to introduce math and language slowly. At the end of the year, the class that had the better foundation was doing better. So sometimes we have to explain to parents in great depth what we're doing and why we're doing it. And sometimes when they don't understand that, I just say, here's the bottom line. You either trust that we know what we're doing or you don't. If you trust us, then I think your child ought to stay here. If you don't trust us, I don't think your child should stay here. We don't want to send him mixed messages. We don't want dad or mom saying, are you doing that old dumb cooking stuff again?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
There was saying in my school that Montessori can be for every child, but not for every parent.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, parents that aren't teachers, and some teachers even, don't really understand the depths of learning that we're talking about. And it's not easy. This is a complicated scientific field. They want, many times, their child to just be happy. Have you heard that a lot of times? And so if they go to school and they're happy, and incidentally they're learning, that's wonderful. Now they do want good grades, and they do want them to, you know, excel, but they don't want it to be too painful. Don't make them work too hard. Some of the parents that I talk to, the most important thing to them is the social group the child is with. I think socialization is extremely important. But whether the child is with the group that wears the right blue jeans or not never entered my mind as a parent. And so it's hard for me, truly hard for me, to understand that if a child needed the program here, that the parent would rather that they'd be over here because that's the right social group for them to be with. But it's their child and it's their decision. We talked a little bit about language development. Here you have a chart that between birth and 3 months, children's communication is crying and cooing. The cries really do communicate things to us, don't they? So if you're a mother, you'll hear them say, I think he needs a diaper change. I think she's hungry. There's just a different sound to these cries. Cooing is just little sounds that they accidentally learn to make. One day when the breath is coming up through the vocal cords, and then they get fascinated with those little cooing sounds. But as early as 3 months, if you're changing a baby's diaper and you're right over them talking to them, you'll see their little mouths start trying to move. I think there's an enormous human desire for communication, don't you? From 3 to 9 months, we have that babbling where they're just bouncing around on sounds like ba, 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 ba. At 9 to 12 months, you get a stage called echolalia, echoing words. So that if we say ba, 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 they start imitating it. Well, that's a big, big step towards speech, real words, because it means they can control the speech musculature to imitate what we are saying. And then those first words around a year. And the vocabulary development we talked about earlier this morning of a minimal of 2,500 to 5,000 words to express themselves. Students with oral language disorders have processing differences in associating meaning to spoken language. They're hearing it, but it's not associating with any kind of meaning. So many of the children that we have in our oral language program in the association method have expressive language disorders. Their receptive language is within normal limits, but their expressive language is much lower than other children. We talked earlier about spoken language being a complex neurological task and written language being one of the zenith things that the brain does. So when you think about it, you think about the child learning what a chair is. So how do they learn chair in spoken language? Well, we're saying things constantly to them like, sit in your little chair, let's pull up your chair, let's get your chair so we can eat or so we can color. Chair, 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 chair. Association gets made, this thing is called a chair. But it's not quite that simple because there is a language concept that they have to understand called constancy. What is it about a chair that makes it a chair? What's the essence of a chair? You sit in it, okay. But you also sit on a couch or a sofa or a divan or whatever your family calls that. And so this is something you sit on that's for one person. Good. Okay. But they don't all look alike, do they? So we have ladder back chairs and we have rocking chairs and we have Queen Anne chairs and we have upholstered chairs, upholstered in every kind of fabric and color. So the child has to get the constancy that even if I can't see all of its legs, if this is something that one person sits on, it's this thing called a chair. And I include everything in that category that's a chair And then the other things, like a stool that I sit on, is excluded. That has another name. See how complicated language development is? So now I've got it in my spoken language. I know the name of this thing called a chair. Now, why is a chair a chair? What was the reason that in English that was the word used for it? Was the reason? It's just arbitrary. It's the word that was given to that object. Now we're going to go to 26 letters with 44 sounds of the English language. And we are going to attach written symbols, totally arbitrary. An A is only an A because we say it is. It says the short vowel sound A because we say it does. We're going to attach those symbols to that object and that spoken language name. Chair. C-H-A-I-R. And why exactly is it spelled that way? Because we say it is. You see how abstract all this is? It's amazing any of us can do it. And unless you've worked with children who struggle, you watch some children learn to read and it's like no effort at all. It's amazing. Now, after all the years of working with children who have these challenges, I've watched children learn to read who don't have these challenges, and it's truly miraculous for me to watch how fast some of this comes, how quickly all these associations are made. So here's the definition of a language learning difference. A language learning different child shall be defined as a child with average or above average intelligence, with adequate vision and hearing. In other words, there's no sensory deprivation, who is at risk to fail when exposed to school experiences using conventional educational techniques. Language learning differences are the result of auditory and visual processing dysfunctions and include the disorders that we've been talking about this morning. The National Institutes of Health defines dyslexia as one of several distinct learning disabilities. They use the term disabilities, many people do. We use differences for the reasons we've been talking about all morning. The brain is different, it's not abnormal. The child doesn't have to have a disability if he has instruction that will help him be able to compensate for some of these processing difficulties. Dyslexia is a specific language-based disorder of constitutional origin. What does that mean? Constitutional origin means hereditary. And it's characterized by trouble with single word decoding. The challenge is I can't bust into these words. I don't know where they break. I don't perceive the patterns of the language. Somebody has to show me. How do you decode this stuff? So why are they having trouble with that single word decoding? In the NIH definition, they emphasize the insufficient phonological processing difficulties. So being able to perceive where are the sounds in the words and to discriminate one sound from another. I also see that with every child I work with who has these difficulties, whether it shows up clearly on their test or not, that there's visual processing and auditory processing integrative difficulties when you're actually working with them. So nobody expects these difficulties in word decoding because they're bright kids like the ones you saw in the video. And as they get older, it doesn't fit with who you thought that child as a learner would be. And you don't understand why he has trouble in this language area, but does very good in math, which many dyslexics do. Or, as one student we had here, he was excellent in language, and he had a serious, severe processing difficulty in mathematics. We worked with him. He left here to go to high school somewhere else when we didn't have a high school. It was a very accelerated school, and the math teacher was flunking him and saying he wasn't trying. So his mom called and said, "Would you go over with me and talk with them?" And so this math teacher had never heard about any of this stuff, about processing. And so I explained it to him, and I said, "Tell me why you think Alex would be making straight A's in his language subjects and come in here and want to fail." It makes no sense whatsoever. This is a motivated student who can't do your subject because of neurological processing deficits. So he kind of believed me. And we talked about ways that he could be helped. They allowed an outside tutor to come in, along with making some changes in the class for extended time on the test and reduction of the number of problems he had to do, as long as he could show them he understood the concept. Dyslexia is not the result of generalized developmental disability or sensory impairment. They can see, they can hear. They're perceiving it incorrectly. And they have various difficulty, variable difficulty. Remember, can do it sometimes, can't do it other times, on the very same information in reading, writing, and spelling. This is the IDA, International Dyslexia Association definition. I just put it in your handout. It's similar. We're not going to go over that. Related disorders refers to learning differences in reading, comprehension, attention, math, coordination, social skills, and language. There's 25 characteristics that we see when we're screening children for learning differences. These on this first page have to do with some of the tests that they are given. Test performance. Then we have perceptual performance. In addition to having these difficulties in reading, writing, and spelling, on test of temporal orientation, being able to judge time and how much time has gone by, or how long it will take them to do a homework assignment, they have very poor judgment of time. And they'll look at a page of math and say, "Oh, it's going to take me 3 years to do this." No, it's really not. Let's cover up with a plain white piece of paper everything but the top line. Now let's just start and do number 1. And as you finish the first line, let's move it down, because they can get overwhelmed with all those squiggles in front of them. Impaired right-left discrimination. I worked with a man who was about 50 years old who came into a program we were running to learn how to read, write, and spell. And he had just found he was dyslexic when his grandson was diagnosed. He told me that when he was in the Army, he would carry a rock in his right hand because when they were marching, he couldn't respond quickly enough as to which was his right and which was his left. And so with the rock, when they called right harch, he would know which way to go. Or left harch, the hand without the rock. But by the time he figured out which was right and left, they would have marched away. So even into adulthood, when most people we can say to them, "Raise your right hand," and it flops up there, he has to stop and think. and they have to think about the directionality and spatial use of everything. Think it through. It's not automatic. Poor spatial orientation. I had a little girl in class one time who walked up the row and bumped into that corner of that desk every time coming to my desk. She didn't know how far out from that piece of furniture to move her body not to hit it. She couldn't perceive that space. So I got a piece of tape and said, this is just between you and me. I'm putting this piece of tape down here so you know that's how far out you have to be in order not to bump into that desk. And after a few weeks, we could take it up because now she could perceive where she needed to be in space. In their work on a paper, testing a high school student, name is John Smith. John, would you write your full name in the top right-hand corner of the piece of paper? John Smith. Now, John Smith has been writing his name all his life, and he doesn't know how much space it takes to get it on the page. So all of these kind of spatial challenges. There's just a research study that's come out that says for dyslexic individuals, if you will have more spaces and larger, somewhat larger print, but more spaces in anything that you're giving them, they can read it better. Well, we've known that for years, so we are constantly saying to teachers, have plenty of white space on this paper so that there's a difference between where the writing is and the rest of the page. Field-dependent perception, that's telling figure from ground. So if you walk up to a painting, you take in the whole painting. And then you look at the detail. This is usual perception. And then you look at the whole again. So most people in this is Gestalt function, looking at form, go from the whole to the part to the whole. In some of the studies of dyslexia, they are seen as going to the whole, and that's where their processing stops. So when we show them some cards called the Berea Gestalt Test of Visual Motor Perception, a set of 12 cards that have different designs on each card. They have a plain white piece of paper, and they're told there's going to be 12 designs or pictures that we want you to look at and then draw it on the paper the very best you can. Now, if they're 8 or older, it's timed. We show them the card for 5 seconds, which sounds short, but it's really not. Put it down and say, draw. And then we do the whole test over again where they just copy them and there's no time presentation. So whether it's timed or untimed, many of these children do something like this. Here's a design. So this is a square within a square within a square. And sometimes they just draw this. And I'll say, okay, good. Anything else? No, that's it. And other times they'll say, you know, there was something in the middle, but I don't remember what it was. Or, yeah, maybe that was in there. Or they'll put something in there. Because they kind of knew there was something there, but the brain didn't go whole, part, whole. It went whole and stuck there. And this is even when they're copying it For some of the students, the longer they look at it, the worse they do. You would think they would always do better on the untimed, but that's not necessarily true. Now, how does that relate to anything? Words are a form, they're a gestalt. Whoops. If I draw a box around these two words, they're the same shape. So if I perceive in wholes and don't perceive well the internal detail, then for me, those two words are the same. The same with words like then, there, when, where, of, for from. So when we see that they have visual motor difficulty seeing something and putting it down on paper, timed requires memory, untimed doesn't require memory, just the ability to copy. Then we most often, always, see these kinds of errors in their reading when we do a test like the Gray Oral Reading Test. So sometimes the score isn't all that bad, but when you look at the errors they make in reading and the errors they make in spelling, they're typically dyslexic errors. Spelling, for example. Dyslexics are the only people I know that could spell a word 5 different ways in 2 paragraphs. Most people that misspell a word simply misspell it the same way every time. So why is this dyslexic person doing it in all these different ways? Well, every time they come to a word and they've got to think of the sounds that are in the word, and as they try to think it through, they're not sure what sounds are in there. So sometimes they spell it one way and sometimes they spell it another way. So I've never seen anyone but dyslexics that do that. Perceptual reversals in reading and writing, some have those reversals and some do not. Impaired reproduction of rhythmic patterns. In a summer program in which we had 200 children at it was on a college campus for an intensive summer program for 8 weeks. During the 8 weeks, 1 hour a day, every day, they went to a class that was called Patterns. And so they were trying to learn to clap out rhythms or to march to rhythms, to use rhythm instruments on the beat. And the music teacher said for the dyslexic students, they could learn less about rhythmic patterns in 8 weeks than most students that she'd have for a week. So for example, she would clap out a rhythm and say, you clap this after me. So this rhythm is 1, 2, 1. And what she'd get back was 3 claps, there's no rhythm in there. And often, when I'm working with students with these rhythmical problems, they're just a little bit off. It's almost like somebody set the dial in their brain just a little bit different. So they're not perceiving where the beat of the rhythm is. So that's the dyslexic population. Now the ADHD population is very, very good about rhythm and beat. And their favorite instrument is the drum, in my experience. Impaired reproduction of tonal patterns. Another thing the music teacher did was present a tone on the piano and have the students try to imitate that tone with their voice. And again, they were off target a little bit. And I said, so how would you describe the tone that they gave back to you? And this is with repeated training with her. She said, well, actually, it was a fifth overtone above the tone that I was presenting, which made kind of a weird oriental harmony. And most, or some, of the people that you might be sitting next to somewhere singing that are off key are having these tonal perception difficulties. Impaired auditory discrimination, telling one sound from another. Impaired visual and auditory memory, holding visual and auditory information in mind long enough to act on it. Many children with learning difference do have some speech irregularities and oral language delays. Many have impaired coordination, but not all. For the most part, the dyslexic individuals that I've worked with have pretty good coordination and balance. They have more problems with rhythm. So if you're doing calisthenics with them, 1, 2, 1, 2, when you're on 1, they're on 2. The ADHD population has, in my experience, a lot more challenges with coordination and balance. Impaired fine motor skills. Being able to use their hands effectively to do tasks that you have to do with your hands, including writing. And so the example that you had this morning was writing with your non-dominant hand was kind of clumsier and more uncomfortable than with your better coordinated automatic motor skills in your dominant hand. So in academic performance, we'll see difficulties with reading, spelling, writing, and sometimes math should be on there. Variability in performance. Don't forget that as a major factor. When somebody's doing it for you one time and can't do it another, does it 3 times and then simply loses it, you tend to think, come on, are you putting me on? I tested a little boy over in a program that we have in Barcelona, Spain in August, and he gave me about 15 letter sounds. I tested him again this May. He knew all his letters, capitals and lowercase. We got to the sounds and he looked at me like, I don't know. Well, let's just take it one at a time. What about this one? What about this one? What about this? They were gone. He got here this summer. He came over for the summer program. He was knowing most of them. For the first 2 weeks, he was hitting on all cylinders, things going well. This morning, it's gone. And so this is the way it goes. We have to teach, reteach, keep reviewing until we get the information to really stick. Poor ability to organize work. I don't think I've ever gotten a folder, a referral folder from anywhere on kids with learning differences that didn't say 2 things. One was poor organizational skills, and the other was immature. Now that immaturity is actually the way they are performing due to their processing problems, which cause them to perform more like a younger child. Therefore, that's the way they're perceived by a lot of people. Just immature, and the way the person says immature means like it's your fault. Grow up, get it together. Slowness in finishing work, we talked about that Paulo Talal study. They do process more slowly. Short attention span for age, in some, not all. and impaired concentration ability in some.